Dr. Maxine Bryan. I am your virtual professor. Now, recently I wrote a blog and it was about defunding the police, the truth about defunding the police. And I wrote that because of an ad that I saw on television by Donald Trump that gives the illusion that people would be calling 911 and there would be no one at the police station to answer. There'd be no dispatcher to dispatch officers because there was no funds for the police. I want to set the record straight today. Defunding police does not mean taking monies away from policing that is needed to do policing. What we have seen in the United States of America is an over-militarization of our police with the type of weaponry that they have and the equipment that they have. Many of our even small town police forces are adequately armed for a major war, right? And we don't need that. The police don't need that type of weaponry. As a matter of fact, what we're finding out is that oftentimes, if there was another entity, say a counselor or a therapist or a social worker on the scene, many of the deaths that have been by police would not have happened. Think about it. If a social worker had been called to interact with George Floyd, perhaps he'd be alive. If a counselor had been called to the scene where Eric Garner was, perhaps he'd be alive. If perhaps even when Stephon Clark was being chased, someone else had been there instead of a police, Stephon could be alive. And one of my most interesting cases is John Crawford up in Ohio. If there had been an intervention other than police, perhaps John Crawford could be alive. So what defunding of the police really does, it moves funding that has been used to militarize our police and puts it in services that can be called on the scene and intervene and de-escalate the situation. That's what defunding is all about. So it's not a loss of protection or lack of services. It's reappropriating funds so that the right services are used and utilized in the right circumstances. Now, I want to tell you about a particular city, for example, in New Jersey, right, where they have defunded their police. They didn't abolish it, but they restructured it. And I want to tell you what has happened. That was in Camden, New Jersey. And they disbanded, but then they got it back together again. And they admittedly say it was a rocky process. But as a result, police corruption has decreased. There's better community relations. There's a reduction in crime. And the cities is being more transparent in the relationship and the goings on of the police force. So I want to remind you of what the statistics say. So what we find out though, as we look at statistics, is that the majority of the 911 calls are for nonviolent encounters, right? So defunding the police means that instead of tying up police personnel and time going after nonviolent encounters, such as George Floyd, such as Eric Garner, such as Stephon Clark, such as John Crawford, instead of going after those kinds of nonviolent encounters, they can really be going after the violent folks who are causing havoc in our community and who are doing great community harm, both to businesses and individuals, right? What this means is that when police are going after and spending time after and using money to go after nonviolent encounters, they may miss some things that are really going on. They are not trained to hone in on some valuable clues about a person's mental status or a mental state or what they're thinking, but a counselor, a therapist is, a social worker is, right? Um, the police would still respond to crime-related calls, and all other calls would be rerouted to an appropriate social service agency that would respond and act on the scene, perhaps accompanied by a law enforcement official. But think about how that could lead to the de-escalation. Philando Castile may even be alive now. That was a non-violent situation if I ever saw one. He was driving with a tail light out and got stopped, told the officer he had a permit to carry, was getting his license or whatever, and did not leave the encounter. Oftentimes when I'm teaching, I use a cartoon, and it's really not funny at all, but I use a cartoon, and the cartoon is called The Talk. The Talk. And on one side of the cartoon is a white father talking to his son, and he's having the talk. And it's about the birds and the bees. On the other side of the cartoon is a black father talking to his son, and he's having the talk. And it's about how to stay alive after an encounter with the law enforcement. We want our police officers to come home alive. We want our citizens to come home alive. One way to make sure that happens is to allocate funds appropriately so that the appropriate people with skills and abilities to de-escalate are responding to our nonviolent calls. And that police then have the manpower and the wherewithal to respond to violent situations as needed. So contrary to what Trump would have us to believe, defunding the police does not mean that there will not be someone to answer your 911 call. Defunding the police does not mean that police will not be on hand to respond to violent situations. And defunding the police does not mean that there's no one to respond to your nonviolent situations. It only means that the appropriate people with the appropriate skills will be responding sufficiently and adequately. Think about that as you're listening and engaging in conversations around what defunding the police really means. This has been your virtual professor, Dr. Maxine Bryant.